friends. So my question to you is, are you feeling enchanted? The Dock Street Theater and our beautiful Charleston, South Carolina will surely cast a spell on you. You might find it hard, actually, to leave our beloved city. Over the last couple of days, I've heard people whispering in my ear, "Are there houses for sale near you?" I'm Carolyn Murray. I am a binya. In other words, someone who's lived in Charleston all her life. And it fills my heart with joy to stand before you and to welcome you to Charleston, South Carolina, to a place where just a few blocks away I was educated and inspired by books to do what I do every day. I've had the privilege of sharing stories as a television news anchor for 35 years in my beloved city, and more recently, thank you. I'm not sure if that means 35 years or wow, 35 years. But at the core of my being lies the profound belief that we are better, we are bolder, we are faster, smarter, and kinder when we embrace the beauty of language. Words possess an extraordinary power. They connect us across divides, they inspire us to dream, and they transform our understanding of the world around us. They are the threads that weave the tapestry of our shared human experiences, capable of fostering understanding and igniting change. As we gather over the next 9 days, let's also honor the deep and complex history of this place I call home, Charleston, a city shaped by the labor and voices of enslaved people whose stories often remain untold. The narratives of my ancestors remind us that the power of language must uplift those who've been silenced. It is our collective responsibilities to ensure that their legacies are woven into the fabric of our conversations and our literature. So with this spirit of inclusivity and understanding, I warmly welcome you to this extraordinary gathering of gifted wordsmiths and passionate readers and listeners. The Charleston Literary Festival is not just a local event. This is a world-class celebration of literature infused with an international flair right here in the heart of my beloved Charleston. Thank you, friends, for being with us this afternoon, and let's celebrate the power of language and all the beauty it brings in our lives. And as part of the ongoing partnership with the Charleston County Public Library to increase accessibility of the Charleston Literary Festival, this event is being simultaneously live streamed to the Dorchester Road Library in North Charleston, and this satellite event is free of charge to all library visitors. So now I want to take a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude to Deborah Kennedy Kennard and Bill Kennard for graciously, yes, that deserves a round of applause, hosting the illuminating conversation between Kerri Forrest and Michele Norris about Michele's bestseller, Our Hidden Conversations. Your generosity and vision have created a wonderful space for dialogue that resonates deeply within all of us. So thank you, Deborah and Bill, for your unwavering support of the arts and for being such inspiring advocates for meaningful discourse. Your commitment to enriching our cultural landscape makes a profound difference, and we are all better for it. And a personal thank you to Bill and Deborah for always inviting my little family, my husband and our daughter, to join them breaking bread around tables. We don't necessarily always bring the weight of some of the people at that table, but you have always made us feel welcome and a part of very important conversations. And so with all of that, it is with intense and immense joy and admiration that I introduce another dear friend, Kerri Forrest, a remarkable woman whose brilliance shines through every endeavor. Kerri is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who has woven her passion for storytelling into the fabric of her life, traveling the globe and bringing to light the narratives that matter. After spending 16 impactful years with networks, MSNBC, NBC, and CBS, Kerri returned to her beloved Charleston, she's a Binya too, driven by a desire to uplift this very community that shaped her. As the Senior Program Director for the Equity and Centered Leadership and Philanthropy at MDC, Kerri is a force for change. Her commitment to creating a South where all people thrive is evident in her tireless work addressing economic, racial, environmental, and gender disparities. Kerri's previous work as the Lowcountry Program Director for the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation showcased her dedication to land conservation and artistic vitality, impacting 9 counties along our beautiful southeastern coast. And beyond her professional achievements, Kerri is a devoted yogi. I'm a yogi, I had to add that, Kerri, whose practice embodies her resilience and grace. And for more than a decade, she has stood by my side, offering support and inspiration through life's challenges. She's warm and wise and has not only served as a mentor for many people in this community, but a cherished friend and a force for good. I'm grateful to have Kerri as a force for good, and on this stage this afternoon, she will serve as the interlocutor in a conversation with none other than the magnificent Michele Norris. And it is truly a pleasure to introduce such a remarkable woman, Michele Norris. Her husband and children say that she is simply the best, an extraordinary wife and loving mother. They affectionately call her Mama Bear. Michele is an award-winning journalist, author, and podcaster who beautifully shared part of her life story in her memoir, The Silence of Grace. Witnessing Michele is nothing short of awe-inspiring. She embodies a rare blend of grace, intention, intellect, love, pouring her heart into every endeavor, from her podcast that explores the common ground found in food to her impactful writings that nourish our minds and souls. When she asked the question, "Tell me about your mama's kitchen," I don't know whether to laugh or cry or just answer the question or put on a pot of rice or grits. You see, Michele's depth and willingness to tackle difficult questions invites us into a world of greater understanding, a gift she generously shares through her words and her very presence. Now, let's chew the meat and spit out the bones about today's conversation. Michele's pioneering work, the Race Card Project, is a groundbreaking initiative that encourages people to share their stories. It all began with a simple request printed on postcards. Race, your thoughts, 6 words, please send. The New York Times hailed her best-selling collection, Our Hidden Conversations, as a vibrant tapestry of voices, likening it to an open mic at a town hall meeting that actually works. So without further ado, friends, let's welcome a conversation between a longtime friend and my new bestie. You decide which is which. Good afternoon.
Wow. That's quite an intro.
What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much for that.
So much. Thank you, Yogi. So
I have to come back and crash one of your yoga
you should
classes.
come to Bikram with us.
There's many reasons to come back to Charleston.
But it's Bikram. I'm just warning you.
Okay.
Okay. And there are a lot of friends here in the audience. It's very interesting. I've been an interlocutor 3 years now.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first year that the phone started blowing up the minute that folks found out that I was going to be your interlocutor. Girl, you get to talk to Michele Norris. People are very excited because you've inspired so much trust throughout your career in the work that you've done. And I think that trust really comes through in the book that we're going to talk about today. But I think before we get started, I just want to let everybody know today it's a conversation. And so we're going to make sure that we have you brought into the conversation as well in a couple of ways. In a couple of minutes, we're going to have some folks come and give you a copy of the book to be able to read one of the 6 words. And then we'll also have an opportunity at the end for you to ask questions of Michele as well. But I want to start by giving you an opportunity to just tell us, how did we get to our hidden conversations? What was the spark that got the project off the ground?
I'll answer your question in just a minute.
Sure.
It's so wonderful to be here. I want to begin with gratitude because I am so very happy to be here and so grateful to be here. And the Charleston Literary Festival, I was talking to my dear friend Sharon Malone, who I was on stage with yesterday, and we said this is the standard by which all festivals should be measured. You create just a wonderful community for the people in the audience and also the authors. And I'd like to thank my friends who helped make this possible, who are in the audience: Brenda, Robin and Tony, Deborah and Bill. Where's Judith? Judith Batty is in here somewhere. That South Carolina crew that opened their arms and really made us feel so comfortable. I just want to say a special thank you to friends like this, because book writing is hard. And when you send a book out into the world, you don't know if it's going to find an audience. And so to have friends like that who fertilize the effort to make sure that a book finds an audience and creates a conversation really means something special. So
Absolutely.
I just wanted a chance to say that. The book began kind of as a Hail Mary pass. I had written the first book. She mentioned that The Grace of Silence, about my family's very complex racial legacy. And I was going out on a 35-city book tour. I used to host a show on National Public Radio called All Things Considered, and I was on sabbatical to go out on this big book tour. And I was going to go to 35 cities, and I was going to be talking about race. And at that time, I thought, nobody wants to talk about race, because that had been my experience. In a newsroom, if I had said, well, maybe we should talk about what role race played in the primaries. Look at the time, I have someplace I need to be. You could clear a room. It was like that Eddie Murphy Saturday Night Live episode where everybody would just leave. So I thought, how am I going to get people to lean into this conversation? Because I spent so much time cloistered in either Studio 2A or 4A that being out on the road was a chance for me to talk to people. So I really wanted to engage, and I thought people would rather eat their toenails than talk about race. So that's where the idea of the postcards came in. I thought, well, maybe if I create an exercise that, this is pre-Wordle, that would encourage people to take this big topic and distill it to one sentence that had only 6 words. And those were the original postcards. I went to my local Kinko's in Washington, D.C., that was next to the Red Door Salon, and I had 200 of these postcards printed. And I shared many of them at a book party, but then I started leaving them all over the country when I traveled. And of the first 200, about 30% came back to me, which is an excellent yield if you know anything about direct marketing.
How shocked were you?
Yeah, it's pretty good. And so then I got my publisher to print more postcards, and then I printed postcards, and then I talk about this in the book, but when I was traveling around the country, I was like the Pied Piper of postcards. I was leaving postcards everywhere. If you went to Starbucks, I was slipping them into the sugar station. I was putting them where they have the menus. There were 2 things my mother probably wouldn't have been happy about. The first postcards I printed were not regulation size, and both my parents were postal workers. And so my mother was like, she was so happy I was supporting the U.S. Postal Service, but she was like, honey, those are not regulation size. So after that, we got them right. And the other thing she might not have been happy about is when I was staying in hotels, most hotels have a Bible in the nightstand. If you were in need of a good word, you'd pick up that Bible, whoop, out would fall a postcard. I was just leaving them. I was putting them in other people's books at the bookstore. But they started to come back to me. And that's when I realized I had to keep going, because you might not think that people can say a lot in 6 words, but people were starting, in the beginning, a lot of it was, oh, why can't we all get along? Or, only one race, the human race. But they started to get pretty deep, white, not allowed to be proud. Only Asian when it's convenient. Reason I ended a sweet relationship. You said dirt, so I scrubbed. And I had to keep going.
Yes.
And I realized I had created, I hit a taproot that on this very difficult subject, that suddenly people were finding a space to share their stories.
Okay. And tap it is, because the things that are shared in the book are very personal, very deeply reflective, very much any of the self-reflection, but also some guilt, some hatred, reactionary. I mean, you've really seen everything over the last 14 years in terms of that emoting. Why do you think that people were willing to take the step?
You know, after 14 years, I still don't know the singular answer to that, but I think it was many things. I think I put the basket on the table at an interesting moment. America had just sent a black family to the White House, so people were thinking about identity. And when I first started this project, may I ask the audience a question?
Sure.
Do you remember the word post-racial? Yes. Now, most of you are like, right, but at the time, we were thinking we were entering a post-racial space, so people were thinking it was maybe done, or we didn't have to talk about it in the same way. And we realized pretty quickly, oh, okay, maybe we do. So that helped. I put the basket on the table at a moment where all of these social media platforms were starting to percolate. And that changed our privacy setting, our personal privacy setting. So people were posting things in ways that they hadn't before. Even on a cell phone, if you had been to the grocery store, you probably have heard in a department store, on public transportation, someone having a conversation that you probably didn't need to hear, right? Like, oh, you know, maybe you shouldn't be, but people think about privacy differently. So people were sharing more, but I think a big reason was modeling. So very early on, the stories that were coming in were so interesting that I wanted to share them. And so I created a website, because I wanted a place where I could, kind of a bulletin board. Literally, it was designed, the first iteration of the website looked like the cards were up on little pins. And it was very rudimentary. And I think that helped also, that the website I created wasn't slick. And we did that on purpose. At that time, the aesthetic in most websites was sort of something like an Apple store, highly fluorescent, very white, very clean. And I said I didn't want to do that. I wanted the website to feel lamplit. I wanted you to feel like you were going in a room. And I didn't want it to look too slick, so it kind of felt like you were in someone's kitchen, you know, or in the den. And when people came in and saw the stories that other people were sharing, I think they felt like they had a seat at the table. Oh, I can share my story too. So I believe it was modeling, because at the beginning, so many of the stories were what we call rainbow and bunny stories. You know, human DNA is 99% the same. People were kind of saying the same. Everyone quoted Rodney King, can't we all just get along? But then when they saw some of the deeper stories, then they started to share deeper stories too. And then on the website, the other key thing we did, and that helped me write this book, is we added, it's funny, I talk about cell phone and the cell phone goes off. We added a section on the form on the website when people sent in their stories, anything else. And so people are like, oh, wait, you want not just my 6 words, but I get to tell you more? And so people would send in a couple sentences, they would send in an essay, they would send in an entire treatise on, you know, on their story. And then they started to send me ephemera. They would send me photographs and maps and pictures of a cemetery that was found, and pictures of, you know, this was me in 6th grade when no one would talk to me. And that created this kind of accidental archive of all of these stories. But I think it was a combination of all of those things where people felt like they had a place to share their story. And I realized that I created this 14-year archive based on a mistake. I thought no one wanted to talk about race, and I was wrong. Actually, people do want to talk about race and identity, because sometimes race is that conversation about them, but identity, you know, that includes all of us. They just want to find the right lane to merge into that conversation. They just want to find the right place to do it. And for a lot of people, this is a place where they could type out their truth in the glow of a computer screen or with their thumbs on their phone.
What I really appreciated about the book is it also has almost the feel of a photo album. Like you have a big family photo album here.
Yeah.
It's really chronicling not one person's history, but the 500,000 stories, the
Yeah.
500,000 six-word essays that you've received in the narratives really give that sense of we all have a piece of this
Yeah.
that we can share.
I wanted, when we were writing the book, when I was working with the team that was designing it with me, it's race. So I wanted it to be inviting. I wanted it to be inviting to the eye. So I really wanted photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted the design to be felicitous. I wanted it to be a jewel box of a book. And my publisher's like, you want 300 photos? 300 color photos? And I was like, yes, I do.
Somebody at the printer's having a field day.
Yeah, and they figured it out, but I wanted people to see other people and yet see themselves.
Yeah.
And in everything I do through the Race Car Project and even through Your Mama's Kitchen, the podcast I host, it's the same thing. I want you to hear other people's stories and be animated by that, but also hear something of yourself to realize that in some cases, I have nothing in common with this person, but I recognize, I recognize that. And so that's why I wanted to create something that was not just my essays. The book contains 13 essays, but in between those essays, there are rivers of six-word stories that sort of buoy the essays. And it's hard, it may be hard for you to imagine what someone could say in 6 words and how it really does feel like Walt Whitman's, symphony of American voices singing. But maybe we can help the audience get a sense of that.
Perfect time.
It's something that I often do when I talk to big audiences, and if we can begin with someone, and I'm just going to point someone out, I'm going to go to my friend Joyce Brayboy, who's right there in the 1, 2, 3, 4th row with the white jacket on. Raise your hand.
Voluntold.
So what we're going to do is we're just going to pass the book and pass the mic a little bit, and just open up the book. There are sections in the book that just have a river of 6-word stories. And open up to the first one that catches your eye and read that out loud, and then you're going to pass it to somebody else.
I happen to turn to page 95, and the second listing that I see is entitled, Hated for Being a White Cop. As a young Native police officer, I mistakenly thought most people would appreciate my sincere desire to help and protect the citizens of my community. I was shocked to find out that some people who didn't even know my name, background, or what was in my heart hated the very sight of me only because I was a white police officer.
Thank you, Joyce. I've talked to Brett Maisel. He lives in Natchitoches. I never pronounced that correctly, so forgive me if I didn't get it right, Texas. And in the daisy chain of police shootings, often as a journalist, the people that I can't talk to are police officers because of FOP rules, because of the defensive posture. And yet, in many cases, police officers have rolled up to the Race Card Project and said, this is my story. And it's a chance for me as a journalist and as a storyteller to have access to a community that I would not otherwise hear from. Who else? Let's go on this side for a second. Gentleman with a blue t-shirt, would you mind? No? Sure, okay.
And he has a copy of the book.
He has a copy of the book already. But we need to give you a microphone.
The first one I was drawn to is Vote Obama. He looks like me.
From Val in Iowa. Yeah. This is why I don't know where my keys are, because I know all these stories. We've collected, when we published the book, there were 500,000 of them. Now there's more than, we're closing in on 800,000. I met Val in Iowa. Val is actually a doctor. It's a man named Val. Has adopted a brown child, little black girl, little African-American girl. And she was so excited when Barack Obama was running for president, and she exclaimed one day when he was trying to decide who to vote for him, he looks like me. And he was really torn about what he should feel about that, because he thought, well, no, you need to know what his policies are. You need to know what his background is. But he said he understood that in Iowa, representation matters. And that statement for him changed the way they ordered their steps as parents. They realized, I need to give this child role models. I need to help make sure that they're in spaces where they see themselves. I'm going to work my way over here, and we're just going to do a couple of others. Maybe we could, in this row, start, and you choose the row, and then we'll pass it that way. Like someone on this side, and then we'll pass it over to this side. Go ahead, you've got the book. And for people watching in Dorchester, if you're wondering what's going on, we're passing the book in the audience and people are reading. I realize there are people who might not understand what's happening right now.
I just opened it to disabled doesn't mean helpless or nothing.
Do you want to read his backstory?
Whoops.
The book closed.
Oh, if you can't find it,
okay.
you can
That's
pass
okay.
it on. But this is someone who had a bad accident, and he said for bad choices that he made. And as a result, car accident. And as a result, he is disabled. And he realized that the world greets him in a different way. And he thinks about identity in a completely different way. And so I put the basket on the table thinking I would hear only about race, but I heard about all kinds of other things, other identity frames.
Okay, I have the book. At least my mother is real. In middle school, I saw nothing wrong with being honest about my past, so anyone who asked, I would tell, I'm adopted. One day in math, I was correcting a classmate's work on a whiteboard, and on my way back to the seat, I heard a boy say under his breath, at least my mother is real.
Do you want to pass it over to this side so we don't leave this side of the room out?
Okay, I just opened to I flourish farming ancient tribal lands.
That's from Ed Kaufman. That's the beginning of a chapter. And Ed is that's the beginning of an essay. Ed is a farmer in Minnesota. And he realized that his family farms land in Minnesota that once belonged to the Lakota Dakota Sioux. And those were his 6 words. And I'll just quickly tell you the story behind that. In a room like this in Morris, Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota Morris, which is one of the outposts, I didn't think I connected with the audience. It was not, sometimes you just feel like, it felt like I was speaking to the frozen chosen. And it was Minnesota, so that was entirely possible. And I can say that because I'm from Minnesota. And I just didn't feel like I connected. But then what happened is, several months later, I got a card from Ed, and I don't know if, it just fell out of his pocket or something. He sent it in, and those were his 6 words. And then a little bit after that, I got another card from someone else who was in the audience who was indigenous. She's Native American, University of Minnesota Morris, originally started as an Indian school, as a school that was meant to indoctrinate Native American children and make them, and anglicize them. And she sent in her 6 words, and she was Lakota Dakota Sioux, who now lives on a reservation in South Dakota because the Lakota Dakota Sioux were forced marched off their land in Minnesota and sent to Dakota. And those cards, I realized, were in conversation with each other, and that's why I wound up writing an entire chapter, about that history. And I realized the history of the War of 1863. I grew up in Minnesota, knew very little about it. And so this is an example of how these 6-word stories also unearth hidden histories. And as a storyteller, it's another way, it's been a taproot for me to understand America. And that little 6 words here and that little 6 words here were like opening up like cracks in a wall that let light in and helped me understand a history that, even though I grew up in Minnesota, even though the name of the state in Minnesota comes from the Lakota Dakota Sioux, they took the people off the land but liked their language enough to keep the name for the state. That's kind of wild. But these 6-word stories for me are little tendrils and tributaries that help me understand America. Thank you all for participating in that little exercise.
So, what's been the most surprising thing? I mean, I would think that ability to see numerous stories playing together in a space because of the conversation that you've been able to open up. Talk a little bit more about some of the surprises.
Well, I am surprised every day that people come to the inbox, and that's what you just witnessed, that's what my days are like. I go to the inbox and I see these are the stories that come over the transom. So that's what the little tiny mighty team I work with, that's what comes over. So I'm surprised every day that people still participate in this. But there have been other surprises. I'm surprised at how many older Americans participate, because when I thought it was, especially when we moved to a digital experience, we still get postcards, but most of the cards come in digitally. And, that was, again, a mistaken assumption that I made, that older people wouldn't be interested in a digital model. They are. One of the biggest surprises is who showed up. Most of our conversations about race in America, if we are honest, are by, for, and about people of color. And if we're really honest, when we're having a conversation about race, the assumption is that we're going to be talking about black folks. And it's going to be black folks talking about black folks. And white people, or really everybody else, will be a bystander. One of the big surprises is that everybody showed up. Native Americans showed up. The Latino diaspora showed up. The Asian diaspora showed up. But the biggest surprise is that in the 14 plus years that we have been doing this, in the majority of those years, the majority of the stories have come from white Americans. And as I say in the book, when I put that basket on the table, I did not know that I was going to be entering a 14-year odyssey of listening to white Americans talk about race.
It's really complex.
I didn't even think that was possible. Because, again, most white Americans are not included in the conversation, but I had to do some introspection. And I realized as a journalist, we're responsible for that in some ways. So when something happens, we call certain people to come in and talk to us about that as sources, as experts, as subject matter experts, or as people who have, a bead on the community. When this community was riven by the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, we went to certain voices, but we didn't go to certain others to say, why did that happen? We went to the people who were grieving, but not people who might help us understand the roots of hatred, or also how people who were not black in the city were hurt also by that. And so I realized I had to do some introspection, but that's not the only reason. Our conversations about race there's a certain sort of momentum that's happened, and it's just an expectation. And this, for some reason, you asked, why things happen. I don't know if it was the modeling. I used to think it was because I was on NPR, and the majority audience on NPR are Caucasians, but I haven't been a member of the NPR on-air family for quite some time, so that doesn't really explain it. It could also be a sign of the times, because at this point, as evidenced, in many things in the news cycle, the conversation about race in America really now is much more focused on white America and the demographic changes that are coming in this country. And in many cases, the future has already arrived, and how all of us will adjust to a country that within our lifetimes will likely be majority minority. And so politically, commercially, there are all kinds of ways that the conversation about race in America is now more about white America, and that certainly is reflected in the inbox.
What I found interesting about the conversations around white America in your book are this arc of don't just assume that white America is a monolith. Very much so how we say don't assume black America is a monolith. And also this tension between white guilt and white anger. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I think Tracy Hart's story might be a good piece to really frame in on that. Yes, I'm tobacco picking white trash. And she talked a little bit in her narrative about, is it more honorable to be a closeted racist or one who's out in the open? And it was a compelling question based on her story, having really become this, I believe, DC diplomat, but she still had her family back in their in their roots, and she was the person that they called for everything because she knew how to fix it because she had gotten her education. But still this tension about those that got left back at home and what she was doing now. Talk a little bit more about Tracy.
That's an example of a story that's a window and a mirror, because Tracy's life is so much different than mine. But I saw it was a window into her life, but a mirror into mine, because there are things that she talks about that I absolutely understood. We did Tracy's story on the radio, so if you're an avid listener to NPR, you may have heard it several years ago. It's a chapter in the book. Tracy Hart is a diplomat in Washington. She works for the World Bank. She is an opera singer. She is very well educated. She speaks multiple languages. She is an expert in water, water delivery systems, and particularly women, and in many parts of the world, if you are a woman and if you are a young girl, that is your job, is to get water. That's where you spend your time. She comes from a rural Virginia, very country roots, very poor family. And it's interesting, she grew up without running water. So, and she didn't put the two together, and I was like, girl, you never understood the connection between your, your job and your, but the benefit of running a project like this is I get to talk to people over time. And when I first met her, she was telling me how hard it was to go home because they think that she's sedity. They think that she's, oh, look at you. They don't like the fact that she lives in DC. They don't like her friends. They don't like the music that she listens to. They don't like the way that she's raising her daughter. They don't like her first husband was Jewish. Her second husband was Muslim. Woo.
Wow.
They, this, and Thanksgiving just became,
impossible.
It was, and yet her family just, oh, Tracy. But at the same time, anytime something happened, they called her. Because she's not a lawyer, but can you help me with this? Can you help us write a will? Can you help us figure this out? We need to figure out, as Dr. Malone told us yesterday, we have to talk to a doctor and we don't know how to do it. Write the script for us, please. So she became the family fixer. And so that was how she remained connected to her family. She's talked to me how her family has changed. And the political conversations that they have in her family, and how she had to find grace in her heart to get past her anger and listen a little bit more to them and understand the roots of some of the things that they were feeling. But it's an interesting story about, being white in America and code switching. Yeah. That term that Black people use to talk about, this is the way I talk when I'm at the beauty store, or the beauty shop, but when I walk into the board meeting, you're not going to hear that vernacular. That's exactly what she does. About people seeing her and assuming, depending on where she is, if she's in Virginia, they assume that she's as country as a sugar sandwich, and that her politics are one way and that her outlook is another way. And then if she's in Washington, D.C., and she's grabbing a coffee near the World Bank, because of the way she dresses there, people assume that she's one of those chewy kind of liberals. And she realizes that she's a walking stereotype depending on where she is and how she's dressing. That's not a story that you necessarily attach to white America. And there are lots of examples of people who feel like they're burdened by a certain stereotype. You mentioned people who have guilt and anger. Inside of that also is a lot of confusion. I don't know what to say. I don't know if I can say anything. If I say the wrong thing, I'm canceled. I'm so sorry I said the wrong thing. People apologize to me almost like a rim shot. Like they say it to me and they're hoping that someone else
It'll get out there.
will find the race card project and maybe know that they feel really horrible about something that happened. And that's one of the lessons in the book for me, is that regret lasts a lifetime. I have so many stories from people who say all the fifth graders except Mavis. She had a birthday party and there was one Black family that lived in town and their parents said, Mavis can't come. And all these years later, she's like, I just wish I could find Mavis and tell her I'm so sorry about that. Someone else who says, I wish I had befriended her. Someone else talked about what it meant for someone in a lunchroom, and we're in the South, so you probably are old enough to remember when integration came to town and how difficult it was, and it was little choices. Little choices. Am I going to put my lunch tray down next to this person? Am I going to befriend them? Am I going to accept that invitation to play basketball with somebody else? that has never left us. And the other lesson for me is that that's how integration happened. I'm walking around your town and I'm seeing all of these placards. They're beautifully signed. Your history of your town is beautifully told in the placards around town. But there's another hidden history of how integration happened bit by bit. Bit by bit. Someone deciding, I'm going to hire this person. Someone deciding, I'm going to stand up for this person. Someone deciding, everybody else is moving and I'm not going to. And the corollary to that is, yeah, I can't live here. I am going to move. Yeah. And those are the little stories, again, that surface in little 6-word stories.
What I'm hearing as you're talking are two things. It's the connecting the conversations. How do you actually get the conversation out of the book and into a room where people can hear each other, can say these things and listen to each other? Because there's so much shared experience in the book that you may not know. You talk about the mirror in the window. Yeah. And so if she's talking about having to code switch and you can understand how you have to code switch, it's a shared reality. But very often we don't get to that part of the conversation because we lived in such a very emotional time. How do we actually get beyond being able to write it down? And this makes me think of, you all may remember about a month ago, Elmo asked everybody how they were doing on social media.
Yes.
And the internet went wild because Elmo wanted to know how you were doing and everybody said how they were doing. And that's great, but how do we talk about it?
I love that you mentioned Elmo because I think that actually sociologists are going to study what happened. Elmo on Twitter just said, "Y'all okay?" And it was like, oh my goodness. No,
we are not okay. No one's okay.
I mean, I literally think people will study that. Telling your story is important because someone needs to hear it. And I kept going with this project and I wrote this book and I maintained the Race Card Project because I want it to be useful. This archive, which is bookended by the presidencies of Barack Obama and, who knows, we'll learn on Tuesday, with Donald Trump and Joe Biden in between. Sorry to give anybody angina who's out there, and tickle your stomach lining. And so many events are captured in this archive. So I want it to be useful to historians, to anthropologists and sociologists and journalists and storytellers in the future. But I also want it to be useful in everyday life. So one of the reasons we designed the book in this way, it's designed so you can read it front to back, but as we saw when we passed the book, you can pick up almost any page and you will meet an interesting person, you will encounter an interesting story, you will get a window into another world. So I hope people keep it. It's why we, this beautiful cover by the artist Kadir Nelson on the coffee table. I heard from someone who had an early galley of the book, and her sons married either outside their faith or outside their race or outside their ethnicity. So their family's, interesting and kind of a quilt. And they kept it on the table at a vacation destination. And in the morning, people would pick it up and read it. And they started having these really robust conversations. I love that. That the book, was sort of a spark for that. And I love that it's used in hundreds of schools. That teachers are using it either as a writing prompt or as a way to access history or as a way for students to talk to each other. The gentleman, or actually Joyce, who read the story about Hated for Being a White Cop, there have been schools that have used this after school shootings in communities, in part because it gives an access point for all kinds of students in the room. Yes, the students who are hurting because someone was shot who looked like them, but also the students who have law enforcement members in their family, the students who have family that works in the healthcare system. And we now know that the book is being used by book clubs around the country where people are coming together and often across difference. Mm-hmm. Like one part of town inviting another part of town. And we're actually encouraging this, and we've done this thing called Dinner a Dozen, where people write to us and tell us how they want to use the book and how it will create a meaningful conversation. And I have sent the people that we choose a dozen books to start the conversation, and I buy them dinner. And because good food always lubricates a conversation. Absolutely. And my publisher's like, you're not supposed to be giving books away. But I really want the book to be useful, and in every case what's happened, we've done it in Oaxaca, Mexico, and we did it in North Carolina, and in Detroit, Michigan, and in Georgia. And in every case, they came together once, and once was not enough. And so they've been, in every one of those cases, they've met at least 3 times. One is on the way to the 5th time. And the circle just keeps getting bigger, and they're inviting more people. And the conversations have been, I get reports afterwards, and they've been difficult. They have to have, rules. We're going to stay at the table. We're going to continue talking. But that's how it starts. Yeah. And I think it works in part because of an anthropological trick. If I had just walked in a room and said, tell me your 6-word story, I might get something out of someone, but if you go to the website, if you look at the book, if you spend time looking at the archive, it renders the pot in a different way. Yeah. And that's an anthropological trick. Zora Neale Hurston was a writer, but she was an anthropologist. And when she traveled around Florida, what she would do is she would gather stories from one town, and then she would take those stories to the next town. She'd tell them stories, and once she told them stories, then she could harvest new stories. But she had to tell them stories before she could get them comfortable to harvest stories. And that's what this book does, and I hope it's what it does for communities, for families, for places in our great nation, because at a divided moment, we have to figure out how we find bridges of understanding so we can figure out how to listen to people, even if we don't agree with them, or perhaps especially when we don't agree with them.
That is the challenge, I think, right now. We're going to open it for questions in just a moment so that everyone else can jump into this conversation as well. But I think this is probably a good question to ask, how people saw what it means to be American in this book. Particularly there's, American and patriot, and how that all became very segmented after 9/11. And several of the stories in the book really talk about before 9/11, unique, after 9/11, Arab, how the world really just kind of changed after that. But talk a little bit about, what does it mean to be American? Why is it so complex, particularly for people who are not white?
Well, there's a whole chapter about this, and I wrote this chapter in part because I was raised by parents who were weirdly patriotic. And I'm not saying that patriotism is weird, I'm saying flying flags in the Rose Garden, was something that, and I don't like admitting this, but I thought, why is my dad wearing flag socks? You remember 1976, he really just went all in on that,
right?
Just all in. And my father was a veteran, he served in a segregated, so my first book was about, he served in a segregated Navy. He loved a country that did not love him back, and yet he loved it fiercely. He fought for it. He believed in America's promise, and he thought that I can show America what it can be by showing America what I can be. And that was, he was the walking myth of the model minority. We were the first black family in our neighborhood. Our lawn was pristine. The yard was, we call it today representing. And a big part of that was love of country. My mother, who just died in June, her favorite sweaters had flags on them. She just liked Americana. And that's a big theme in this book, is people who want to feel like they're American, but for a lot of people, America feels like a label that doesn't apply to them.
Or that you just can't ever reach it.
They can't reach it. Will my son be American enough? And I think the question you ask is why it's harder for people of color. America has been equated with whiteness, if we are honest. And that is true, that has been true for a long time. So for a lot of people, when they've come here over centuries, if you're talk about immigration now, immigrant means something different than it did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But 50 years ago and 100 years ago, when people were coming here and trying to assimilate in order to become more American, what they were often doing is leaving something behind, their language, their food, the rhythms of their life, to achieve something that felt American to them. And I realized that that is not unique to people of color. A lot of people talked about, my parents were Latvian. We couldn't speak the language outside of the house. The house only smelled Latvian on Sundays. My parents, they wanted us to be American, so they didn't lean into their Italian background, their German background, whatever it is. But there is a gatekeeping aspect to America, and there has been a gatekeeping aspect around the flag. And I write in the book about how, we all become our parents. I started displaying the flag. I realized the flag is really important to me because it's mine too. And one of the epiphanies for me is I was at a gas station and there was a guy in a truck and he had a gigantic flag. I mean, it's like he took it from Perkins Cake and Steak. It was like, those big, huge flags. It was just massive. And he pulled up and loud music and standing there, and it was sort of like, huh. And I walked by him and I said, "Go America, right on," And I don't even know why I said that, because "Go America" is not something I would normally say, except for the Olympics. But I wanted him, in that moment, it was like, it's mine too. And that's, and I think there are a lot of people who feel that, who have a love of country, but who feel like America it's like a cup with a handle that's not turned toward them.
Yeah.
And we have to change that.
Yeah, I cringe a little at the word patriot as well. Patriot, because it's sort of the same. Why is it necessary to use that as the label to differentiate whether you really do belong here or not?
Yeah, I think my father was practiced a kind of patriotism that lives in me and that I want to give to my children.
Yeah.
To love a country but question its history, even when it gives you indigestion. To love a country but sometimes question it. To love a country that might break your heart sometimes, but to love it anyway, as you would love a family member.
Let's open it up for some questions. If you'll raise your hand, I see right here. That's about 5 rows back.
You alluded to the fact that the website is still up and archiving, and this book is beautiful and being used, but what do you envision for the future of the Race Card project as you continue to keep getting more submissions?
I hope it is, as a storyteller, it is a wonderful content well, and so we want to continue to tell stories, and maybe through new forms. So we've been experimenting with the idea. We've created a podcast pilot. Hopefully it will be a podcast one day. Short form video, animation. We had a group of college students that were interested in taking some of the stories and turning them into animation. As I mentioned, the archive needs to outlive me. Years from now, as I've done research, you're a former journalist, you know what a gold mine this would be. If you're trying to understand 1920s America, 1940s America, 1970s America, you're often going to original source material, to letters and diaries, but to have open source information like this where people are telling their story unfiltered by census questions or something. So I know it will be useful in the future, so I have to find the right home for it. We've also talked about doing installations in places where you can sort of walk through. We were in a session ideating with a group of museum directors, and they were talking about perhaps you could walk through a tunnel and you would hear all these voices, so it would feel like a symphony, and then come out on the other side and tell your own story. So it's an interesting playground that I want to frolic in a little bit and continue. But the important thing is to continue. I don't want it to be a menagerie that I'm just holding on to these stories. I want to give it back.
Other question?
As you birthed this into the world, what have you heard as an afterword that has given you the most hope?
So there are instances where I've seen people linger after readings and talk to each other. As I mentioned, the fact that people continue telling their stories, and we don't do as much with the comment section because the comment section is a rain of fist, and it took all of my time just to moderate that. But when we see the conversations that are happening in these book group sessions, where people come together, oftentimes who didn't like each other, we modeled that on something that Mitch Landrieu was doing in New Orleans called the Welcome Table. And that was modeled after something that William Winter did in Mississippi. But the idea that you bring people together over food and let them talk about a difficult subject. One of the things that gives me hope here is the diversity of voices that we hear. So a lot of people who otherwise would probably not knock on my door, who are much more conservative than me, who have a different political outlet than me, sometimes they send in their 6-word stories and they're, well, I know you're not going to print this. And then I put it on the website, and they're like, thank you for giving me a voice. And if you go to the website, if you pick up the book, I guarantee you, you will be offended by something that you see. I guarantee you. But we're holding a mirror up to America, and it's race. So you shouldn't like everything you see. You should see things that make you uncomfortable. And the fact that people are trusting us to tell that story tells me that as divided as we are, that people still are looking for tethers. And the other thing that that gives me a little bit of hope is the way that we get called by schools, factory in Michigan, factory in Kentucky. You know, how can we use something like this so people on the factory floor, people who work in the hospital, can talk to each other? Because right now, everything that is dividing us politically, is what they're saying, is affecting my workplace. You know, people aren't talking to each other. People are, they can't create trust. They can't create the kind of environment that leads to innovation. They can't create the kind of environment. I mean, one person in one of the factory told me that people are calling in sick because there's so much tension at work. It's almost like I feel too good to go to work today. It's like, I'm not calling in sick, I'm calling in well. Like, I don't want to ruin my mood by going to work today because I know I'm just going to get in an argument with somebody. And so the fact that they come here means they're looking for something. And that means there's seekers out there that are looking for something better. That actually, I don't like those people, but I kind of want to know. I want to know a little bit about them. And that should give us hope. That should give us hope, because that, I think, is the beginning of something. And dialogue alone won't get us there, but curiosity will help us get there.
Yeah. Another question?
Yes. I hate to bring up television, but you all brought up Elmo, so I'm not going to feel bad. I never knew about Tulsa until The Watchmen was shared via HBO. And I find that amazing that this event was introduced to us by HBO. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I saw the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but I never saw the Diane Carroll Show because it wasn't allowed to be on television.
You didn't see Julia?
It wasn't part of Charlotte, North Carolina programming. I don't know if they showed Mr. Rogers with the mailman and their feet in the tub together, which was one of the most important integration moments, I think, in the 60s, maybe.
Yeah.
But PBS did so much of that for us. And I've only learned about an event that, having grown up in Charlotte, there was a Tulsa-style event in Charlotte that is now an augmented reality tour that I never heard of growing up in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system. And it was many, many blocks of a prosperous city. And I don't really have a question, but just thank you for...
Well, you shouldn't feel bad about that, first of all, about not knowing about these things. I didn't know about, Mankato, the largest mass hanging happened in Mankato, where 38 members of the Lakota Sioux were hanged. It was sanctioned by Abraham Lincoln as part of the War of 1863. Never knew about it. It wasn't taught. So I have two things to say about that. One, the importance of art, that in telling the American story. HBO is doing a lot of good business in a show like that. Books, art, documentaries, songs, folklore, all of that is part of how we tell our story and how we tell our history. And I think it makes it harder to suppress the history that is taught in schools, because it seems folly to say we're not going to teach things in schools, but kids are going to be able to find it elsewhere. So that's the importance of art. But the other thing about Tulsa, you shouldn't feel bad about it because it wasn't taught, but you also should understand that there was an assiduous effort to make sure that you didn't know about it. All of the police records have been disappeared. Most of the newspaper renderings of what happened, accounts, photographs, all disappeared. And I discovered this because when you mentioned about what we're working on, the pilot that we put together for the podcast that we're trying to build about this came from someone whose 6-word story led us down one of those rabbit holes, because his grandfather was a Western Union delivery man on the night of the Tulsa massacre in 1925, and used to tell his kids about it at the dining room table. And so the young man, he's not a young man anymore, but as a young man, he heard his grandfather tell this story, and they actually recorded it. And so through these recordings, we were able to go back and look at what happened in Tulsa. America is the home of the brave and the land of amnesia sometimes. And I don't want to preach about this, but I do have something to say about this. We need to figure out how to look over our shoulder at a difficult history in the way that you look at a rearview mirror if you're trying to drive, so it serves as a guidepost as you go forward. And I know that this is a debate, particularly in this region of the country. And I've talked many times about the lessons that I've learned. One of the lessons that I take from this is, personally, my faith teaches me that I hope that at the end of my life, I will not be judged by the worst of my actions. But my faith also teaches me that I will never be my best self unless I take the lessons from the worst of my actions. And that applies to an individual, and it applies to a country.
Michele, thank you so much for this absolutely engaging hour.
Thank you.
I'm so pleased to have had a chance to talk with you and to spend this time with my friends, my new friend.
My new friend.
Thank you so much. Our Hidden Conversations, What America Really Thinks About Race and Identity.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Ann Blessing. I'm the secretary of the board, and I'd just like to thank Michele Norris. We're just so lucky to have her here. Thank you for her compliments for the Charleston Literary Festival. And thank you so much for being the manifestation of our motto, which is embrace the conversation. We're so grateful to our sponsors, who are Bill Kennard and my fellow board member, Deborah Kennedy Kennard. And thank you so much to this fabulous audience. You are great. Please support our independent bookseller, Buxton Books. And the way you can do that is by going out the back doors, buying a book. And Michele has agreed to sign books. So you'll go out these doors and go to the left, and she will sign your book for you. And the book is absolutely beautiful, filled with the stories that you heard and more. So thank you so much for being here. And please join me again in one more round of applause for Kerri and Michele.